Hi, my name is Levi. I'm a technical writer for Red Hat, and I'm gonna be talking about technical writer's workflow. This may or may not be relatable to you because I'm only talking about my own experience, because even within our company, different writers work at their own pace, and some steps might be different for you in particular. I think Yuri can second that. And also, if we can make it interactive. So if you want to stop me, ask questions, disagree with me or anything like that, please feel free to. You can argue, you can converse, whatever you want. So I decided to start my presentation at creating your first draft. And we can split that roughly into 3 parts, which is gathering information, doing your own research, and most importantly, saying the most using the least amount of language. So we can start with gathering the information, and there you will have quite a few points of contact depending on what product you are working on. The most important would be subject matter experts or SMEs and quality assurance, quality engineering. You can prepare by collecting some background information, preparing a list of questions. You can ask them to demonstrate what they're working on, how it works, what is the idea behind the product, how does it relate back to the end user or the customer. The more preparation you do on this first step, the easier it would be to actually create your first draft. After that, you can start organizing your information into some logical units, which at Red Hat we call them user stories. This step is essentially extracting stuff from people's heads, in this particular case from the development folks, and organizing them in a hierarchical and probably logical structure that would be easy to consume for the end user. Also, it is important to keep in mind that while developers and QA are a very important source of information, they are not our end user, and something that is common sense for developers and QE may or may not be obvious to the end user. Also, a lot of the time with the products, they are not used by our customers the way they were intended by the developers. So it is another good thing to keep in mind while communicating with the subject matter experts. So the other part would be doing your own research, and here you can go as creative or as crazy as you want to. Obviously, if you have a life, you might omit some of the steps. If you do not like me, you can reach out to a bunch of people. The single important thing is to actually do the audience analysis before starting your writing process. Because if someone is a specialist in, say, networking or network management, they will need a bit more specific information than someone who is just trying to connect to their Wi-Fi using an M2E tool or something like that. It would also influence how your text is going to look like, because if it is for a more particular audience, you can omit a lot of details. If it is for the beginner level audience, then you might want to use diagrams, images, or graphics. Understanding the needs of your audience is key, and it would help you to avoid over-educating your customer on the subject that they are not really interested in. Because a lot of the time when people come to technical documentation, it is usually the last resource. They try to Google, they try to watch videos, they try to communicate with their friends or go on Stack Overflow, and they're usually pretty annoyed when they get to the product documentation. So if we can keep it short and sweet, while keeping their needs in mind, it would be the most useful way to write your documentation. You can also reach out to support teams. They usually have a lot of information on what the customers are doing with the product and what are the most frequent support cases for this particular product. This will ensure that the support people like you, but it will also increase the amount of Jira tickets you get from the support, because when they notice that you're responding to the customer cases, they will start asking you to perhaps write something else or specify something in the documentation, but it also promotes the healthy environment between different teams. If you want to, you can also reach to marketing teams. Like I know previous speakers mentioned the developer portals. We also have one of those at Red Hat, and sometimes people forget that we have a developer portal and it rarely gets updated. Unfortunately, sometimes teams are not in the loop with each other, and if you really want to get your point across, and if you really want your product to be more noticeable, you can definitely reach out to the marketing team in your particular organization and ask them how do they promote the product and how can you help them. You can also utilize the analytics tool, like for instance here at Red Hat we have Adobe Analytics, and you can be pretty surprised when you see the results, because within my short time at Red Hat I've seen guides that pull thousands and thousands of people every day, and I've also seen guides that have like 60 views over the period of 6 months or so. So it is good to check from time to time how is your documentation doing, and perhaps if it is not doing well, think about what the problem is. Is it the writing? Is it the style of the guide? Or maybe no one just uses this tool, which can also be the case. The next thing is saying the most using the least amount of language. And if anyone wants to speak out loud about what they consider to be good documentation or what they consider not to be good documentation, if anyone wants to speak up, please do.
Well, technical documentation certainly shouldn't be as long as possible to show how much work we have done.
That's a good one. Anyone else has any ideas?
I think also apart from the language, which is very aptly expressed in the quote you have on the slide, saying the most using the least amount of language. I think also the structure is very important, and thinking about making it very logical and consistent, so that when the user is reading the, let's say, manual, they always know what to expect. So it shouldn't really be surprising, but more like the structure should be consistent so that every option is described the same way. So if a user that's been working with the manual for some time need to quickly access some information, they already know that they need to, for example, scroll to the bottom of the description for tips or stuff like that.
Yeah, and technical documentation certainly needs to use consistent terminology in terms of industry standards, and also in terms of, the branding and internal communications of a company or organization.
Yeah, those are all really great points. And what do you think it should not use? Like technical documentation in general, linguistically or otherwise?
This goes together with the terminology. It shouldn't use homonyms, is it called in English? To use alternative terms to describe the same thing.
Yeah, that is very important. Yeah, definitely so.
And also not many, or if possible, avoid any, idioms phrasal verbs, things that maybe is perfect for a native speaker, but might not be as understandable by not people who for whom English is not their first language. So they might, if I'm trying to explain a complicated technical issue, this will only make the understanding more difficult for them.
Yeah, that is a great thing to keep in mind, especially writing for the international audience like most of us do.
For me, the most important thing is, and I'm still learning it, actually, it's the task for my whole life, how to explain complex things easily. And I know there are ways like simplified English and task-oriented approach, but actually how I recognize great writer that they are able to explain. They're great teachers. So it doesn't matter if it is full of fluff or not, but what matters is that you can really understand what the writer wanted to share with you. And it must be clear and concise. Otherwise, based on the documentation, I can make terrible mistakes.
Yeah,
If I may, so from my point of view, the good documentation should respect the target audience, and it should use the language which is understandable for the target audience, and it should help the user to use the product easily and immediately. It should help him to work with that, and it shouldn't bore him with some detailed descriptions or some stuff like this.
Yeah, so I mentioned some of the stuff that you guys were talking about, but I decided to keep it in a shorter list. So in my personal opinion, first and foremost, the documentation should be correct, and that is technically correct. Because even the most beautifully written documentation is essentially useless if it is not based on factual and relevant information that the user needs to perform the tasks. Second of all, as many of you mentioned, it should be clear, because unfortunately, even if the documentation is correct, but it has a lot of idioms or a lot of fluff in it, in that case, users would most likely skip it, because users have only so many hours in their day to read the documentation, and with the amount of information that is available on the internet, they might as well find something more concise in another place, which is another point I'm making here. Concise documentation is really important for technical writing, because a lot of the time we don't realize under which circumstances our customers are reading our documentation. We can never assume that they are reading that in a sterile environment with no screaming kids, no boss that is hanging behind their shoulder. So making it concise and straight to the point is really important. Also, another part is making it relevant, because you can write a big manual, for instance, about Linux file permissions, but if the user is not interested in that particular thing and they came to the documentation just to see how to set the permissions, not to read about the whole history, that is not really good technical documentation in that case. So coming to what it shouldn't be. Well, as many of you said, it shouldn't be long. At Red Hat, we used to make this mistake where we tried to write our guides as if it was a book. But in the fast-paced environment that we are living in today, we can never assume that a person has a lot of time or effort to read our documentation. They might be on site with the client, they might be in a place that doesn't have good internet connection, and making the customer search through the documentation to find relevant parts will not really fly in today's society. Another thing is not making the documentation complex. While arguably sometimes you have to use complex language in order to get the point across when you are describing something complicated, but generally it is advisable to avoid that, primarily because a lot of people who read our documentation are not native speakers of English. And if we can at all help them understand the technology by using this simple language in the simplest terms possible, it would be really beneficial and would actually increase the company's reputation in the long term. The other two things are not making documentation emotional or not attributing human characteristics to machines or non-human entities. Because unfortunately, this is the case with a lot of mostly startups, I would say, when they're trying to be hype and buddy-buddy with their customers. Unfortunately, customers do not really tend to like that, which is indicated by several case studies made in the Netherlands. So if you are trying to write about a procedure, and you might as well think it is a dumb procedure, but probably not a good idea to use this wording in the documentation. And also, of course, always think about your consumer. Think about the person who is sitting on the other side of the screen and reading your documentation. Who are they? Are they a systems administrator? Are they a network administrator? Are they a developer? Or are they a person who is, in our case, new to Linux and just wants to learn how stuff works? All those people would require different types of documentation. And in turn, it will require different levels of complexity. So it is advisable to always keep that in mind. After we created, supposedly, our first draft, here at Red Hat, we have to submit it for SME review, QA review, and peer review. Peer review being another technical writer, that poor soul, reading through your documentation and trying to improve on that, which I sometimes feel sorry for the folks who read mine, like Jirja and Katka. I'm really sorry, guys. You have to suffer from my documentation. Yeah, at this point, we just edit and revise the documentation. And ideally, after every single review, your documentation should become shorter and shorter. Ideally, they say it should be 20% shorter than it used to be. And another point to make here is it is advisable to always test your documentation. Ideally, QA and SMEs should test it for the procedure correctness, but sometimes people are overworked, underpaid, and maybe they just don't feel like it. So they would message you with something like, oh, that looks good to me. So if you at all can, it is an amazing idea to, if you are documenting an ID, just click through it, see how it works. It doesn't work based on your procedural steps. Does your hierarchy allow for the users to get confused? Or does your documentation need some kind of prerequisites? Because it is really annoying for the user to get to the middle of the guide and suddenly find out that they should have started some additional service or get some kind of subscription, and now they have to go back and start from the beginning. So always a good idea to keep that in mind. And obviously after that, you can publish, probably revise again, and just maintain your documentation. So if anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to agree or disagree with me. I welcome any type of feedback that you might have.
I was surprised to see that QA review precedes the peer review, but we have clarified that QA tests the procedures, and peer review is well for proofreading, I would say. So that makes complete sense.
Yeah, generally speaking, some technical writers would first do peer reviews, then go through SME and QA review. I think it can waste a bit of time because usually after the peer review, you would have to revise something one way or another. And a lot of the time, it is more important to make it technically correct and then focus on the language. I think Katka said it in the chat, and that peer reviews are mostly not for technical stuff. So that's why I put it in that particular sequence. But obviously, sometimes you can go back and forth between all those steps.
Yeah, but it definitely makes sense to give priority to fact-checking and procedure testing before the language.
And is there something that you guys do as technical writers that probably wasn't mentioned by me? What are your technical secrets, so to speak?
I have just a quick question, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
So you have a QA review and a peer review. How long does it usually take for a piece of documentation to go to full circle of reviews?
It really depends. Like, it can take anywhere from a few days to a few months, if I'm being honest. It really depends on what type of relationship you've built with your subsystem and with your peer reviewers, fellow technical writers. Because if your subsystem is on a smaller scale, so to speak, or if you have good relationships with them, they would usually give you back your documentation within a day or so, in my personal experience. But it is better to allow more time for the testing and for peer reviewing. We generally, like in my subsystem, we allow at least 2 weeks, but a lot of the time it is not necessary, because if you warn people in advance what type of time constraints you have, a lot of people will try to accommodate you.
Yeah, I'm asking you especially because over the last year, especially, there's been lots of pressure to somehow transfer into continuous delivery. So basically what they're asking is releasing documentation every 14 days or so. Kind of like, you know, whatever we have gets published, and then every, let's say, 2 months, there is like a bigger release when, you know, it should be like for the continuous releases, it doesn't really have to be that checked. For the big one, it should be thoroughly checked, but still, the way it's the way our workload is set currently, where there isn't that much time to even do peer review of any sorts. So it would be nice if we got to do it, and our team has been trying to do it at least partially. But the only real, like, we do have to get approved by a native speaker language check. So we have a person to whom we send the documentation who check it for grammar and also consistency and stuff like that from the language point of view. But there isn't really that much time for peer reviews, and especially, you know, they don't really deem it as necessary, so we do not get allocated time for it.
I can see why, kind of. Like, I used to work on a product that had a release every month or so, like a major release. And back then, a lot of the time, we would have to omit the peer review, just because we want to allow more time for the QA and SMEs to check it. Like, I would always send it to SMEs and QA, but if there was no time, I would omit peer review and ask someone to review the text after the fact, when it was already published, because it is easier to publish something and then push the minor grammar changes, rather than have someone from the technical perspective say to you that, hey, this guide is useless because here is the mistake in the procedure that you've been describing. But yeah, definitely some of the parts can be omitted if you have a lot of time pressure or a lot of rolling releases.
Yeah, thanks. So tricky thing to navigate, especially since the pushes for like even the developers are not that content to go forward with the continuous delivery, especially on the project I write documentation for, because it's very conservative and has special rights within the company, basically because it's the main product, but I'd say that the team of developers working on it is very nerdy. That's the best way to put it. And because the product is very tricky and very old, so it's very difficult to manage, they get special rights, basically. So they get to be a bit the odd one out. But still the push is there. So
Well, yeah, navigating this whole process can definitely be tough, especially with like legacy documentation.